Keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast on our Instagram handle at the Wolf Connection Pod, or email us your questions, comments, and guest ideas to podcast@wolfconnection.org. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. A guest that we have not had on our podcast in, I believe, possibly 2.5 years, but it's always lovely to have this wonderful woman to share her knowledge, share her thoughts about everything that's going on with wolves in Colorado. She's coming to us from Redstone, Colorado. She is still the wildlife chair of the Sierra Club in Colorado and also an ecologist for the Colorado National Heritage Program for Colorado State University, and that is Delia Malone. Delia, it is wonderful to have you back. Like I said, long time no speak. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and it's a pleasure to be back, and I'm so happy that you are continuing your quest to understand all things wolf in Colorado. I'm doing great. I think the wolves that we have in Colorado are also doing well. And I think personally, from an ecological view, I'm excited. I'm still enthusiastic about having wolves in Colorado and having more wolves in Colorado.
That's terrific. Just give everybody a refresher, Delia. How long have you been doing this specific work? Because when we had you on, like I said, a couple of years ago, you were already deep in the throes of getting, the ballot initiative was already passed and working towards reintroduction. How long have you been working on this particular project for everybody who may be tuning in for the first time?
Well, we really started our quest to have wolves reintroduced to Colorado. We kind of, as a collaborative group of NGOs, we came together in 2015 and brought this collective vision together and have been working on that ever since. We all knew that it wasn't going to be a short-term deal, that we were all in it for the long haul, and we knew that we all needed to be in it for the long haul. It was a lot more than just getting wolves here into Colorado. It's keeping wolves protected so that they can do what wolves do best and heal and restore our natural world.
Did it feel like it took longer than you expected, or is this right on time?
I think, actually, oddly enough, it seems like 2020 was when we elected the wolves was just here.
Yep.
So the last 4 years have been filled with controversy and a lot of conversations and a lot of discussion. And so those 4 years have flown by. And I think the next maybe 10 will also fly by.
The years do fly by now, don't they? It takes 2 seconds.
Yeah, they really do. I mean, talk about some of those conversations that you're having, I guess, because we don't need to, I think, revisit all of the things leading up to the reintroduction because paws are now here on the ground. What have you seen from your perspective this past calendar year since the first wolves were brought back into the state?
Well, I have seen a lot of the same recalcitrance on the part of livestock producers. And I guess I shouldn't be hugely surprised, and I shouldn't be thinking that this is going to take only a year or two. We've been in this situation for a couple hundred years. And we have a lot to overcome. And mostly we have this mindset to overcome, and it's going to take a long time. A mindset that the only good wolf is a dead wolf. The federal government spent a whole lot of dollars exterminating wolves. And we can't, and in their absence, in the absence of wolves, really yes, wolves were here in Colorado a wolf was here in Colorado up until 1945. But as far as a population of wolves, that was ecologically effective, in other words, a sufficient number to do what wolves do, that was really over by 1890. So more than 100 years, we haven't had wolves doing what wolves do on the landscape to restore a balance for well over 100 years. That mindset only percolated during that time that we finally got rid of them. Yay. And now here's a bunch of wolf huggers that want to bring them back. And so I think our biggest accomplishment and our biggest still hurdle to get over is changing that mindset. So a huge amount of education is ongoing. To get Coloradans to the point where we could elect them took a huge amount of education. And now our next big hurdle is to rewild our hearts. I'm going to quote Mark Bekoff, so that when we bring wild critters back to the landscape, we're not bringing them back just to be shot or trapped. We're bringing them back to thrive. And that is the next huge hurdle that we'll take, and which we are really focused on, is changing that mindset through a lot of correction of misinformation and bringing the wisdom, the facts, and the understandings that have been gained over the last 30 years or so up in the Northern Rockies, where people have really come to understand how to avoid conflict and how to live with bears and wolves and fishers and lynx. And we can bring that to Colorado. And that is what our focus has been over this last year.
When you talk ecological facts and the way, the broad view of not just wolves being on the landscape, but the entire set of species that make an ecological system run, what are the ways in which yourself or some of your colleagues are trying to bridge that divide or that gap of, like you said, misinformation, or plugging in the missing puzzle pieces of knowledge so that people get the full picture and they're not specifically focused on just the singular animal and looking at everything as a whole?
So simply put, I would say that that is an ecological perspective. So when we look at things with an ecological perspective, we look at everything from the plants to the bugs, to our really popular megafauna, wolves and bears. How do we get there? I would say my strategy to get there is to get people outside. As a teacher, probably one of my most effective strategies was to bring my students outdoors. And yes, you can read a lot of scientific studies. You can talk about the research, which is essential. But to get people outside, to rebuild those connections. And yes, it's hot, and sometimes it's really hard, and it's sweaty, and then sometimes it's cold, and your feet get muddy, and then sometimes you fall in a stream and land on your tush and you get wet. And all of that reconnects people with the outside world. And that is, again, that term, rewilding your heart, to say, oh my goodness, isn't that bird magnificent? How can that little, that little few grams of a bird fly all the way the heck down to South America and back, and I can't even walk 5 miles? That's extraordinary. And reconnecting people with those, with that wonderful outdoors. And then you can say, well, shoot, we've lost 2.9 billion birds We have 2.9 billion birds, fewer birds in North America than we did 40 years ago. Yeah, that's a statistic. But when you have people outdoors, you say, oh my goodness, there's that Western tanager that is this orange glowing head and this yellow body, and there's much fewer of them. And wolves, because of their ecological role, can help restore them. That resonates. If you just read it and you don't really have that connection with being outside and seeing the tanagers or the Wilson's warblers, um, or, or the American dipper, I don't think that really resonates how important wolves are in this whole picture. So I think that was an answer to your question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and this idea of rewilding is really an interesting thing because one of the comments you see often about rewilding is why? Why do we need to rewild everything? We've been fine, in quotations. We've been fine for decades the way it's been. Why do we need to rewild everything? Why do we have to be doing this?
Well, see, there's the little kernel of your question that really needs to be brought to light. And I hear it all the time also. I hear it all the time. Everything's fine. Why do we need to change now? The key is everything is not fine.
Right. Exactly.
It's sort of like that frog they put the frog in the boiling water and it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. And finally it dies. That is what we're doing. And I'll point to about back in, 1997, 98, 99, something. I was conducting a stream health assessment in our watershed. And I was able to go on a lot of private lands and conduct that assessment. And I was doing a quantitative assessment. And some of the private landowners that allowed me to go on their land, when they read the report, they called me and they said, why did we get such a bad score? And I said, well, let me come out and let's take a walk. And let's look at the stream and let's look at the riparian vegetation. And initially, when we would go out, they would say, well, it's always looked like this. It's fine. Everything's fine. Well, no, it hasn't always looked like this. And everything is not fine. Streams in the arid West, as a specific example, and this ties directly into wolves. Streams are dependent on stream health. Stream flows that support fish are dependent on the health of the surrounding landscape, because in the arid season, when we get to the dry season, August, stream flows diminish, and what's maintaining those stream flows is discharge from the surrounding soils into the stream. Well, if the vegetation isn't suitable, if there isn't enough of it, then during spring, when flooding flows from snowmelt occur, those flooding flows are supposed to overbank and recharge the sponge. If that doesn't happen, then the sponge is dry and the streams aren't maintained. So where do wolves come into this? Where do mountain lions come into this? They come very clearly into moving around the mule deer and the elk so that they don't overbrowse the vegetation. And that vegetation consequently acts to help those overbanking flows. That vegetation is also critical in sustaining songbirds. So we're all, that's such an overused phrase, but it's so true that we're all so intimately connected. If we look at our population of birds in Colorado, like across North America, our populations, even our common species that used to be thick as thieves, are declining dramatically. It's not okay. Our insect populations that are essential for pollinating our crops in a practical sense, if we want to think about practical things, insects are essential for crop pollination. Our insects are declining dramatically. Those insects depend on native flowering plants to survive. So we're all we're all dependent. Um, you know, politically, right now in Colorado, the legislature is trying to cut the budget because we're over budget. And so wolves and restoration is on the chopping block. And one of the cries is that, oh, we don't need wolves. Why don't we put the money towards children's services? Well, of course, children's services. I would push back and say we do need wolves. We absolutely need wolves because to your question, everything is not fine. Biodiversity across the world in Colorado is crashing, and we need the plants. We need, a very positive thing is that Colorado Parks and Wildlife is redoing the state wildlife action plan. And one of the very positive things that came out of the last legislative session was the inclusion of plants as a species that could be under the jurisdiction of Colorado Parks and Wildlife, which means they can protect them. So prior to this, plants, even though they were listed, they could be listed as an endangered species federally, they had no protection. They were, they were pretty much at the bottom of the barrel with regard to other species. But we need the plants, we need the insects, we need the wolves to protect the plants, we need the plants to protect the soils. Another thing that I've been involved in is we have this oil and gas commission. It's called the ECMC. What does that mean? That means the acronyms I've forgotten. But they were tasked to conduct the Energy and Carbon Management Commission. They were tasked to come up with a new sort of vision where wildlife and human life was prioritized over extraction. And so they've been having their meetings. And one of the big challenges was to come up with a cumulative impacts assessment, a way to analyze the cumulative impacts of oil and gas development on wildlife. So in other words, yes, the erode fragments habitat, but it does more than that. It obviously directly removes habitat, but when it fragments habitat, it interrupts migration pathways. When not just for the big critters like deer, but also for pollinators. So when we fragment habitat, we not only interrupt migration corridors, but we alter hydrology. So the movement of soil water into streams. How do we evaluate all of that to come up with a plan that maintains or even perhaps hopefully restores wildlife in Colorado? And so the state wildlife action plan, because it includes plants, and I'm a big plant person, we can start looking at the fundamental foundation of ecosystems. We're not just looking at the top, we're looking at the entire ecosystem. So we're talking about those connections.
Exactly. Yeah. And what I love about this is more of a statement than a question, but what I love about the sort of diversity or the intelligence of your thought process is that you're poking a hole in the misconception that pro-predator or pro-wolf in quotation folks are all saying that, wolves are a cure-all for everything we're dealing with on their own. But really, it's simply that they're an essential element to the cure that we need, and they're effective in moving ungulates in a way that only large predators can do. And there aren't many large predators, and wolves being the pack predator that they are, they can do that more effectively than individual predators. So they're just this really essential piece to a healthy ecosystem. And it's one of the problems I have with the term wolf lovers, that which I see constantly in comments, and it bothers me so much because I find it problematic to diminish a group of really intelligent people to their love of a certain species, and only because they're cuddly and cute in pictures, and not to consider that most folks are thinking like you're thinking, and they're actually in support of predators thriving because they want to see biodiversity, healthy ecosystems, and the nuanced benefits or the micro benefits that instinctual hunting predators, predator-prey dynamics bring to the landscape. So I'm just, I just love the broadness of your thought process.
Well, and that's you've put it perfectly. What I mean when I say an ecological perspective.
Yeah.
And, we can think back decades to comments by, some of our heroes, Aldo Leopold and
Yep.
Adolf Murray and so on and so forth, where they all started realizing, and both Leopold and Murray were prime sinners in this, in that until they got out into the field, until they started pulling those pieces out, they didn't realize that they really were essential.
Yeah.
And given wolves are fairly magnificent,
Sure. Yeah.
but so are monarch butterflies.
Yeah. 100%.
And so I think, and people often say, well, why focus on wolves? Why is that? Because as you just described, they are key to keeping the system, the whole house, all the components together. And it's not just focusing on wolves, but wolves, when they come back, when they're restored, they enable us to start putting the other pieces back in place. There's a funny thing, because another big project that we're working on is beaver restoration.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of pushback. Similar, when I first started talking about beaver and restoring beaver, they are too cute and cuddly. And when you hold a beaver, they're awesome.
Yeah.
I never realized how much pushback there would be.
Yeah.
For the concept of beaver. But, when we think about it, and it's like, oh my God, beaver are going to be everywhere if we don't kill them. Well, if there's wolves and lions, no, they won't be.
Right.
Right. It's a puzzle, and you got to put the whole thing together.
Exactly.
You just have to. But the pack predator dynamic, I mean, coyotes hunt in packs too from time to time, but a lot of times they're individual hunters. I think that the thing that a lot of people downplay is that this pack dynamic, it does whatever other predators do, it does that more because they're a pack of predators. It's a totally different thing, and it's like a very essential piece to just this puzzle that we're talking about. I think people are like, we don't need wolves, and I almost think we kind of do. We kind of need that dynamic that they bring. It's just I don't know what else replicates it, and certainly humans cannot replicate this, because the aspect of or the thing about hunting with instinct or necessity versus hunting with preference and knowledge or tech has a completely different effect on the wilderness or nature.
Well, and again, what the science shows is, so I think it's, there's a need for both the science and the ethics.
Right.
To use the science properly. And so what the science tells us about that is that wolves, and it's sort of kind of a no-brainer, that they hunt primarily the older, and typically the age is somewhere around the older females, 13 years and older, and the young ones, compared to us humans hunting the prime age. And so we get a completely different effect
Yeah.
When the wolves get rid of the older and the diseased and the younger, then we get this, I was funny at a physician today talking with him, and he was talking about genetics. And when we cull out, humans do it, we cull out the weak and the diseased to improve herd health of cattle or sheep or whatever it is. Wolves do the same thing.
Right.
They are improving the genetics of whatever the prey is that they are predating.
Right. I mean, that's when you talk, and another thing too, Stephen, and I think you meant this also, is that when humans seem to hunt, it's also there's a
Right.
selectivity to it, looking for, like you say, the largest antlered animal or the biggest bull or the biggest doe, whatever it may be. I don't prescribe to know the intricacies of hunting or the reasoning for everyone as a collective who hunts, because everybody's different. But yeah, it speaks to, right, this primal instinct as a pack-based animal to be able to naturally move these creatures about the landscape. For you, Delia, because we talked a little bit about I hate to use crisis, but I'll use it, just sort of like biodiversity, the crisis, and where we sort of sit at this juncture in the late stages of 2024. If you were to take a snapshot of where Colorado is currently in that biodiversity track with the first round of reintroductions through, I know they're preparing another round of reintroductions, I believe between December and March from what I'm reading. Biodiversity wise or ecologically, whatever is easier for you to explain, where do you think Colorado sits at this moment? Are they, and it's so early, so please don't say, whatever you feel. Where do you think Colorado is on this line of ecological health or biodiversity health as we sit here?
I know this isn't going to be a popular statement, but from my perspective of walking a whole lot of hundreds of miles every field season over the last several decades, a good part of Colorado, almost all of Colorado on the west slope, not nearly as much on the Front Range. We are in a biodiversity crisis. We have lost so much. And the back to the other state, well, everything's fine. A number of years ago, I had done some work on the Front Range, and I was looking at a piece of state land, and I thought to myself, gee, it doesn't make sense to me that there is all of this cholla cactus, CHOLLI, cholla cactus in Colorado. It just doesn't seem right to me. So I started digging around because I was trying to write up my report. And I started digging around, and I came across a book in Google Scholar Archives, 1898 through 1906, 08, something like that. The biological survey, one of the first biological surveys of Colorado. And the surveyor was going county by county and inventorying all the plants and all the animals. And this is a gold mine. So I went to my county that I was in at the time with all of this cholla cactus, and no surprise to me, but a good documentation. In 1900 or whatever exactly it was, there was no cholla cactus in Colorado. It was the shortgrass prairie. But because of the alteration of the shortgrass prairie by livestock and the severe overgrazing, not only did the cholla cactus have the opportunity to invade those species that were dependent on the shortgrass prairie, no longer had the habitat they needed to survive, and they were gone. A specific example on the Front Range in stream riparian habitat, Western yellow-billed cuckoos, the guy barely mentioned them because they were so common. So now Western yellow-billed cuckoos are listed in federally listed threatened species. On the west slope, if we go not too far west of where I live, out into Garfield, Rio Blanco, down to Montrose counties and all those counties, the landscape is so decimated and so overrun, for instance, with cheatgrass that covers hundreds and hundreds of miles. All of the birds, not all, many of the birds and the mammals and the reptiles and the amphibians that depended on that historic native vegetation cannot survive anymore because the habitat they need has been so altered. So we have lost very much. We have lost a lot. And in that losing of the species, we also have lost and this is a practical approach to why the heck do we need a bird besides its inherent intrinsic value. They perform really important functions that benefit us: stream health, tree health, grassland health, and so on and so on. So when we lose those species, which we have lost a tremendous number of individuals and species, we also lose the functions that they provide to us. So why do we need wolves? Why can't we just cut the budget? Why don't we just put that money towards people? Because the very thing that supports people is being lost.
So describe, I'm curious more specifically about how these changes happen. So grazing cattle eat the diverse plant life, and then one single species of plant ends up dominating that landscape, or how does that transfer from lots of plants to a few dominant plants happen?
That's a really insightful question and a really important one, because it's not just one sort of impact. So cattle, like anybody else, they have certain plants that they like and certain plants that they don't like. So there are certain plants are more palatable than other plants. Certain plants have a high amount of terpenes or whatever chemicals there are that make them unpalatable. So, of course, they're going to graze out the palatable ones,
Right.
which allows other less palatable ones to invade. Another impact, literal impact, is the change in soils. So cattle are big and they're heavy, and they tend to stand in one place, and they tend to compact soils. So when that compaction occurs, so we're doing a couple of things. Now we're going to remove the palatable vegetation. We're going to allow other species that are less palatable, often invasives, non-native invasives, that are tolerant of these degraded soil conditions to invade, like cheatgrass, or like smooth brome, or like Russian knapweed, or a couple dozen others. We're going to allow those to invade, which is going to, if there are any natives remaining, because the soil conditions have been altered, have been degraded, soils have been compacted. When soils are compacted, instead of that soil, it turns into, for instance, asphalt. Well, when rain falls on asphalt, it tends to run off instead of absorb. So the soils are not only compacted, they're drying out. So only plants that will tolerate compacted, drying, and because there's less cover, there's less shade. We're getting hotter soils. So we have a lot of various factors that are interacting to continue this downward spiral into degradation of the soils. When the soils dry out, another thing happens, and this is happening a factor that's really important. Instead of storing carbon, which soils do really well, when they start drying out, the microbes that are in those soils that bind things together no longer store carbon. The carbon is released up into the atmosphere. So
Unreal.
carbon, instead of soil being this major storage house of carbon,
Yeah.
it is actually releasing carbon. So we continue this downward spiral. And so, of course, the carbon is causing warming, and the warming is, and then we can just continue that scenario and play into this continued downward spiral into why is the West changing?
Yep.
And all of these factors are interacting to contribute to this downward spiral. The good news, we can change it. We don't have to continue. We
So,
don't
so,
have to stay on this path.
so does that affect food sources for, I assume that it does, or how does it affect food sources for native species like elk and deer when all of the palatable plant species are kind of gone?
Well, it's as you would suspect.
No food.
We let me look to mule deer best because
Yeah.
mule deer are much more selective in their taste than our elk. Elk, a friend of mine a long time ago, Jim Halfpenny up in Yellowstone, one he said, and I'll never forget this. He said, elk can eat everything. They not only eat the cereal in the box, they can eat the box. So, elk, they're pretty Catholic in their taste. Mule deer are much more selective, and they just can't do that. So, um, we're seeing, and it's not, here's another a bit of important information. Mule deer need, um, they like to forage on forbs. They don't really forage on grasses. During winter, they're able to digest sage, one of the few animals that is, and so uh, they in winter they really require sage, healthy sage habitat. When the spring comes and that sage, if it's healthy, if the sage habitat is healthy, there will be lots of forbs, broadleaf flowering plants that are coming up between the sage, and that is really what the mule deer are focusing on, and they sort of follow that green up as it happens from lower to higher elevation. So when we see the decline, what the livestock industry likes to do is chain out the sage because the sage is not palatable to cows. Cows want the same things that the mule deer want. They want the forbs that are those nice, tasty, highly nutritious forbs that are growing between the shrubs. They graze those all out, the cattle, and there's not much left for the deer. And in Colorado, indeed, and it's not just because of the livestock industry, it's the oil and gas industry has a lot to do with this too, as does housing development. There's not nearly enough forage for the mule deer population, and the mule deer population is dramatically declining in Colorado, and likely due to an interaction of these various development activities and elk, and a burgeoning population of elk in Colorado, about 303,000 of them now, can eat anything, and so they outcompete deer. So you combine all those factors, you combine oil and gas and livestock and elk and housing and golf courses, and you see a more sensitive species like mule deer decline.
That whole bit it was fascinating, but it's incredibly
it is.
scary.
It is scary.
I mean, just the way that you put it
Well,
out. Go
and
ahead. Sorry.
I think what's scary to me about it, and this kind of gets back to an early question you asked, what's scary to me about it is that people drive across Western Colorado and it looks beautiful from their car.
Sure.
They don't realize, and I had a woman, a rancher's wife, say to me, this is years ago, and these little kernels stay in my brain, and I use them, and it's important. She said, Dee, everything looks fine. My husband and I just took a drive across Colorado, and everything is so green.
Right.
And I said, well, but that's cheatgrass. that you're seeing that's so green. And yes, it's beautiful, but it's cheatgrass. It's displaced all the natives. It's fire prone. It is the worst thing we can have. But people don't realize that. So how do you change that? You get people out there
Yeah.
and you do just a little bit of education, and it makes it's an eye opener, and it makes people want to change.
So when you look at the broader, because you just gave us the broader picture of everything, and when we look at, you were saying about the SWAP, the State Wildlife Action Plan, and we look at livestock and ranching and grazing and all of these other factors, where is there an implementation process to get this type of information? Because this is the stuff I feel, again, from sitting here, that this would be valuable information for those that are working the landscape, that are on the Western Slope, that are dealing with the wolves that are coming in, or any predator for that matter, and the changing of their lifestyle a little bit, that they would understand the multi-tiered problem that is there. Is this stuff available for people? What's the best way to get this? Because I think that's when Steve and I always have these conversations and these strategies and these alarm bells are ringing, and it doesn't seem as though, I don't think due to anyone's fault, just of like, how does this get into the right folks' hands so they're aware of this stuff?
Yeah, it's just it's a little nerve-wracking, the amount of us that are sort of limited to this idea that it's an elk and wolf
Folks'
problem.
hands.
You know, more wolves
So they're
means
aware of
less
this
elk,
stuff.
and there's major change coming, and there are tiers and tiers of nuance here. It's just not that simple.
Yeah, that's kind of my question.
Well, and that is the struggle. That is the hurdle, because, you know, you and me, none of us like change. You know, we're sort of creatures of like, we like our pillow the way we like it, and don't tell me I need to have a different pillow. You know, the phrase education is really very simple and perhaps overused. And I think it's, you know, there is, I am hopeful. And I'm hopeful because I see little nicks of change occurring. And it's because, you know, it's not going to happen quick. We've been at this mindset that only a good wolf is a dead wolf. We've been at that mindset for hundreds of years. And so I hope it doesn't take us hundreds of years to change that. But it's not going to happen in 4 years. It is going to happen, though. I believe, and I believe because I see, and I talk with folks, and I don't mean just the wolf huggers over in Boulder. I mean even the sheep ranchers and the cattle ranchers. Not all of them, certainly not many, but I see, and I've talked with a few that are willing and that are brave enough, and I think brave is an appropriate word, to try to take a step towards change. And that step towards change is not just that it's change, but it's also really bucking the community, bucking the ranching industry, because the ranching industry is fairly adamant that they do not want anything that interferes in their mind with the production of livestock. And so any individual rancher, producer, farmer that goes against that is not viewed with a lot of friendliness. And so there's a
I'm
lot of,
sure.
it takes a brave person to take that first step towards change.
Yeah, that must be it, because, you know, in my experience, ranchers, that I know or I'm friends with or that I'm exposed to are wildly intelligent in this exact subject matter. It surprises me what they know about the land and the animals, the plants, the seasons, whatever. So this larger sort of discrepancy between ranchers and folks that are considered pro rewilding, it makes very little sense to me. It would really make sense that it's more of a fear to implement this or to communicate this type of knowledge.
I mean, what are the things, Delia, that you're hearing? Give people out there a couple of nuggets that you're hearing. Like, what are the changes that people, the baby steps that people are taking that you've noticed, that you see these little, like you said, these little bouts of change that are happening?
Well, so we've hosted over the last couple of months what we're calling a series, and we have several more coming up, a series of outreach events called Coexistence Works. And both for ranchers and for the general public, so that everyone can be on the same page with this. And so what I'm hearing, particularly important to me, and what I've seen, is that there are a couple of producers that are willing to say, okay, I will try this. I will have professional experts with range riding or with herding or with guard dogs come out to my ranch. And we have a couple of these that are being set up now. Not a lot, but a few. And just those are the steps that are willing to take the step to say, okay, and that we're actually willing to take the step to travel quite a distance to come to these outreach events and actually talk with the people we brought in that were expert in preventing conflict and taking their time out of their, mucking hay and doing stuff on the ranch to come and listen to these folks and take that chance. So we've had a good result. And both younger as well as older producers have stepped up. And that gives me hope.
I mean, when we go forward, and you've said this, you have hope, you believe that there's positivity going forward about the way that this is going. So I think we all, or most of us, I would say, would hope this ends up doing the best, wolves doing the best that they can, and the ecosystem trying to right itself along with human help. Is there any other pieces of wisdom or knowledge that you can disperse to people who are listening right now, that if they're not in Colorado, and this may be some of the disconnect, right? As we see from afar dramatization, we see, what's happening on the ground, things people say are happening or not happening, whatever it is. What can people take away from this conversation from your perspective that they can have the same hope as you, or go into action to help with these projects? Are there places to go so that people can lend maybe their knowledge or their set of skills to be able to promote these types of rewilding, biodiversity, all these types of actions that will help every Coloradan, as opposed to just the ones that are being impacted?
So hope in my mind comes because of action. It's not just a dream. It is reality. But your hope only becomes reality if you do something. So thank you for that. We have in our coexistence outreach events, we've brought in experts that have lived with wolves and lived with livestock and been successful at doing that and bringing that to Colorado. So, and bringing that to Colorado's producers, but as well as to the public, because there seems to be this sort of gristmill thing going around that, oh my goodness, we made a mistake. We should have never voted for wolves. This is ballot box biology. And oh my God, we should leave it to the professionals. Well, Yes, we made some missteps, and CPW made some missteps, but they also did some really good things. And if we continue on this pathway, we need people out there. I would love to have people come and help with education. And the best thing to do that, boy, there's nothing like taking people out to the McGinnis National Monument to show them the oceans of cheatgrass that have invaded hundreds of miles of land. And how do we change that? How do we restore? And that is how we get people involved. There's plenty of things that people need to do right now where it's not just wolves. Again, putting wolves out there without giving them the protections they need is not going to be successful for the wolves. It's not going to be successful for Colorado. It's not going to be successful for the livestock producers. If I have a minute, I can just regress and I can give a really marvelous example. I think you've had Glenn Elzinga from Alder Spring Ranch on your podcast. Maybe if not, boy, he'd be a great one because he turned a rode hard and put up wet ranch up in Idaho into a ranch where the soils are actually absorbing carbon instead of releasing carbon. The streams are flowing. The diversity of the plant life on the range has dramatically increased. We can do this. His is prime example is that it can be done. We need people, and I would love to have people join us in the education campaign to get out there, help us with the coexistence workshops to get people out and talking with, and I think what works best with the coexistence aspect, talking with producers, is to have, well, it's the only way it works, is to have someone that's actually done it, that actually lives with wolves and lives with livestock successfully, to come and talk with those folks. So that is what we need. It's a broad brush education that speaks to the need for rewilding at all levels, rewilding the wildlife and rewilding our hearts.
Right. Just before we wrap up, John, can I ask what you think the missteps have been with the reintroduction? Because it seems like folks on both sides of this issue agree with that. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Well, before we needed to have, in my opinion, we needed to have, and livestock producers needed to have a solid, I'm going to use the word coexistence, methodology implementation in place before wolves were ever on the ground. We needed range riders. We don't have to spend $1 zillion right up front. We only have 9 wolves. It's not like we have 5,000 wolves to deal with all of a sudden, right? And we know where those wolves are. So we can put range riders where those wolves are to prevent conflict between, or we can put herders. If wolves are near to sheep, we can put herders. We can be working with those producers where we know the wolves are to prevent that conflict. We should have had that in place. CPW knew where they were going to put those wolves. We should have been coordinating with the producers in those areas so that it wasn't a surprise. And we could have prevented, we should have had a carcass removal plan in place, doing it already so that we didn't have open carcass pits, so that the wolves wouldn't have been attracted to those locations. We could have prevented that issue. We could have prevented the livestock losses had they, CPW staff knew where they were going to put those wolves. Go out to those producers and say, hey, this is what we need to do to prevent conflict and to prevent your losses.
Wow.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, and Stephen, you still have a
Okay,
question
sorry.
right out of my mouth. Good job. You must have been hearing me through telepathically because I wanted to touch on that too, Delia, before we wrapped up, was just the not even the misstep portion which Stephen covered, but also the obviously the people on the ground noticing different things than what's being reported, and obviously that's how media is portrayed, and what's positive, what's negative, this and the other. But I think we've all seen like the vitriol that comes out for the people that are working in the park service or are dealing with the wolves on the ground and things of that sort. And it seems social tolerance for wolves being a completely separate issue, it seems as though the social tolerance for those involved with the project in many different ways, that social tolerance is fairly low too. Are you seeing that on the ground as well, that there's less people coming to the table for compromise and for working through these issues? Or are people just willing, that, like you said before, that it seems like they just want to cut it out at the knees and just say we messed up and that's it, it's all over?
Unfortunately, the social tolerance or the relationship between CPW and livestock producers has definitely gone south. The relationship needs to be restored. I think there's a lot of misinformation that the producers have, and a lot of misinformation that the general public has as well. And, why is that? Boy, wolves are a controversial subject. And one would think that after 30 years of this up in the Northern Rockies, that the vitriol would have dissipated. Not so. I think up there it's just ramped up. And I think we can take a huge lesson as to what not to do by what's happened in the Northern Rockies. And we still, I firmly believe, we still have time to correct those missteps. And I think that CPW right now, with getting a range riding program in place, with getting a more efficacious coexistence program in place, they will know where they're going to put those wolves that are coming in, and they will coordinate with the ranchers. And I think that is going to be key. And I think there are other, we are doing our coexistence outreach and actually, helping to sponsor coexistence experts with regard to sheep and cattle so that we can help with that effort. And I think when ranchers don't lose livestock to wolves, what I've heard from ranchers that have tried these conflict prevention methods, then you can look at a wolf as not an adversary,
Yeah.
but you can start to appreciate how really amazing they are. But while they're eating your sheep or eating your cows, you can't really appreciate that.
Yeah, there's no way.
It's just like, oh my
Right.
goodness, we got to get rid of this critter.
Yeah.
So
Right.
I think
I-
we still have a chance to not repeat the Northern Rocky
Yeah.
scenario.
I want to touch on one last thing too before we let you go. And again, thank you,
Yeah.
Delia, for all this.
Fascinating.
We just love listening to you talk about all of this stuff. It's truly fascinating. We mentioned a friend of yours, Mark Beckoff, and he had said we're on his mailing list, and so we get articles. And
He's
this
a busy
one
guy, man.
came up. He's a busy guy. And Mark, if you're listening, or hopefully he's listening, just a shout out to you and all that you do. You're truly phenomenal. But I sent you the link to this article, and I just want to hear your thoughts about when we talk about the next couple of, I guess, pack of 15, whatever wolves they're going to reintroduce, I think over the course of the next 3 years or so, talking about the personality of the wolves or the type of wolf, don't regress, not type, really the personality of the wolves that you're relocating here. Do you think there's some validity to this, understanding that relocating an animal from one state to another or one country to another or from a different setting, that will have an impact where the wolves come from in relation to how they're going to navigate this specific landscape? Because if they're coming from Oregon to Colorado, it's different. They're coming from Canada to Colorado, it's different. Do you think there's something to that we have to be a little bit more aware of this when selecting the ones that are coming? What do you think?
Well, there's several questions in there. There's several concepts in
Sure.
there. The first, probably most important aspect of wolves for everyone to know, and I think many folks probably do, but maybe they don't appreciate just how important this is. If you were to say one thing, if you were to characterize or explain one thing about wolves that is essential, is family. A wolf's family is everything, not only for their survival, for their physical survival, but for their emotional survival. And in that family, there are different personalities, if you will. If you're an omega at the bottom of the pack, you didn't develop into an omega, you were born an omega. If you're an alpha at the top of the pack, the breeder, you didn't develop into an alpha. You were born an alpha. That's genetic, just like your behaviors are genetic. Some of them learned, but a good deal of them are determined genetically. So absolutely, wolves have different personalities. Each of those personalities is essential to the survival of the family.
Yeah.
The omega, even though he's at the bottom of the pack order, he is just as important as the alpha. The ones in the middle, they're kind of fluctuating and flexing around as far as position. They are also just as important as the alpha and the omega. So yes, absolutely different personalities. Those personalities are a good portion, just like us. Our personalities, is it nurture or is it nature? I think it's both. And with wolves, I think it's both as well. So are you going to pick just an alpha? If you could, would that be smart? Well, we also need the omega. If you could you pick just the betas in there? Well, we need the alpha and the betas and the omegas because they all depend on each other. You know, what's that Rudyard Kipling, remember Jungle Book? The strength of the wolf is the pack, and the strength of the pack is the wolf. They each need. So ideally, if I were in charge, which I'm not, if I were in charge and I were going to translocate wolves, I would strive, and I think they can do this, to get the entire family and translocate the entire family and do what's called a soft release instead of the hard release, which is what they did here in Colorado, and it's what they did in Idaho. They did a soft release in Yellowstone. Does it make a difference bringing them from Canada to Colorado or from Oregon to Colorado or whatever it is? You know, ecologically speaking, aspen groves are very similar here and in Oregon and in Canada. Spruce fir forests are similar in Canada and Oregon and Colorado. Elk, ditto. So, and I think wolves are flexible enough and smart enough in their behaviors that they can accommodate that. What they cannot accommodate is being by themselves. They need family. And that has been demonstrated observed for decades. This is nothing new, really. It's putting it into a scientific journal that might be new. But there's been a lot of scientists over the decades, from Gordon Haber up in Alaska, working in Denali, who clearly described this, that every individual is essential in that family.
I don't know. I could hear you talk all day. I mean, it's just like, it's really great. No, it's really, this is the kind of conversation that we are always looking to have. And it's such an absolute pleasure to have you on to really go through the intricacies and really zoom out so that everyone can see it from literally the bird's eye view. Because you talked about birds so much in this, and the plants and the insects and everything else. So it's really just a beautiful way to have this conversation and to make sure that it's looked at this way, that it's not just about the wolf, it's about every single solitary thing that is on the landscape. I know I asked you this years ago and I don't remember your answer, so I'm going to ask you one more again. When you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
Wild.
Delia Malone, everyone. Again, thank you so much for your insight and your candor. It's such a great discussion to have with you. Thank you so much, Delia.
Well, thank you. And thank you, listeners. And this is the kind of conversation that we need to have across Colorado with everyone. So thank you so much for the conversation.
Absolutely. Anytime. Hang tight while we sign off. How's to you all out there? We'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.